So yeah, the title of this presentation is Why It's Hard to Enshrine Proposer-Builder Separation. This is kind of a theme that we've been playing around with as we explore like the existence of out-of-protocol proposer-builder separation and thinking about what it could look like to put it in protocol. So I'm excited to kind of jump in. Quick outline. I'll start by defining what PBS is, talk about in and out of protocol PBS, and then talk about the simplest ePBS instantiation. E just stands for enshrined, so that's kind of shorthand when we're talking about in-protocol PBS. And then the second half of the presentation is kind of about what would actually happen if we did enshrine something. And so the first half is kind of thinking about the ideal, and the second half is the practical, where we face some of these issues around potentially bypassability of the protocol. And then we talk about these things called trustless relays, which might potentially like help address this problem, and some cryptographic things that would be necessary to make trustless relays a reality. I'll do a super high level picture of what PBS is. So PBS stands for proposer-builder separation. And the idea is here we have, two actors. Proposer is the person interacting with Ethereum consensus. So we have the stake symbol. They're the ones who put up the 32 ETH to participate. They want to build blocks, they want to attest to blocks, and they want to earn rewards for doing that process. The builder is quite a different actor. So they're connected to maybe different centralized exchanges. They might have inventory on those exchanges to be able to make trades and balance pools between decentralized exchanges and centralized exchanges. They're also listening to the public mempool and trying to pick up transactions from there. So they might be like geo-distributed over the world. They might have like very low latency connections with lots of peers. And they might also be getting private order flow. So these are transactions that might not show up in the mempool, but still, are valid Ethereum transactions will end up being put into a block, but the builder might have exclusive access to them in the way that the proposer doesn't. So yeah, the kind of TLDR here is that these two characters are very different roles. And the idea of PBS is to kind of formalize the difference between these two roles in order to make sure that proposers have access to the same opportunities that a builder has without necessarily needing to belong to like an off-chain agreement. So like staking pools like Lido or Coinbase might have access to builder flow because they're more sophisticated entities. They can have off-chain agreements and stuff. But we want the like long tail of proposers, the long tail of validators who are like solo stakers running from a machine in their garage to be able to access the same builder market. So that's the whole point of PBS, is to try and like separate these two roles and define a mechanism, like a public mechanism, that they can both participate in order to make this market more transparent and more accessible to everyone. Cool. So what is out-of-protocol PBS? And we kind of are in this interesting regime here where we have a PBS system that is very much live and active, but it is happening outside of the scope of the Ethereum protocol. So this thing is called MEV-Boost. This is the software built by Flashbots and kind of designed and released right when the merge happened a little over a year ago. And in MEV-Boost, you have three participants. You have builders, relays, and proposers. And the kind of flow of information goes from the builder. They send blocks to the relay. The relay sends what are called headers to the proposer. The proposer signs the header. And this is kind of how the block production pipeline is facilitated. And there's kind of two important trust assumptions here. And what the relay essentially serves as here is a broker of trust between the builder and the proposer, because neither of these entities necessarily wants to trust the other one, but they're both willing to trust this relay who sits in the middle of them and facilitates this auction. So the builder trusts the relay to not steal the builder's MEV. So as the builder is producing blocks, constructing these kind of strategically ordered transactions to extract the most MEV as possible, the relay has access to these list of transactions in the clear and could, in theory, like steal the MEV, reorder the transactions, et cetera, et cetera. But the builder trusts the relay not to do that. The proposer trusts the relay to give them a valid header to sign. So this is kind of an important feature of MEV-Boost, which is that the whole block is sent from the builder to the relay, but the relay only sends basically a blinded version of the block to the proposer. So in terms of what the transactions show up as on the proposer end, it's just a hash of the list of transactions. So they don't actually know any of the contents of what they're signing. So when they sign over that thing, when they sign over that header, they're making a commitment to that block, even though they don't know that that block is valid. And they don't even know that that block necessarily pays them accurately, given the bid that the builder made. So those are the kind of the two key trust assumptions that MEV-Boost makes and that the relay embodies in order to make the auction happen. So yeah, just kind of quick summary, Relay serves as a mutually trusted auctioneer. The validators, the proposers, have, they're running their client software, so they're running like Prism or Lighthouse, and then they're running Geth. That's like kind of the two components that are the execution and consensus layer client that every validator has to run. But they also sign up to run this extra software called MEV-Boost. MEV-Boost interacts with a relay, and that's how they outsource their block production to this builder market. And in terms of adoption, this is essentially how almost every block in Ethereum is built right now. 95 plus around that % of blocks are built using MEV-Boost. And basically immediately post-merge, like this number went from 0 all the way up to 90 plus %. So yeah, this is kind of the regime we're in. And whether or not it's the right place and the right decision historically is, I think, still up for debate. But like the reality is that like most blocks in Ethereum are built using this system. And there's like very good product market fit both on the builder end, because the builders now have a way to compete and try and vie for all these blocks that are getting produced. And the proposers also benefit here because they get access to the builder block, which is much more valuable than the block they would build if they just built it locally themselves. Cool. So what we're trying to do when we talk about in-protocol PBS is, and this kind of meme Enshrine, and I like this picture because it says a fantasy. And sometimes it does feel like this goal is a fantasy, but the idea here is very simple, and it's to get rid of relays, right? So we were just talking about how there's 3 participants in this out-of-protocol version. Relays are kind of bad in a lot of ways. They are not funded. They're generally trusted, which is like kind of antithetical to one of the core value props of Ethereum. And they also are pretty centralized, right? There's only a few of them, and almost all blocks flow through one of like 5 relays. If there's ever an issue with one of those relays, like it could potentially have serious effects on the like liveness of the chain. It's kind of this fragility vector that we're stuck with. So the goal would be to simply get rid of the relays, but it turns out this is like not actually as easy as it sounds. But we'll get to that. So what are the 2 features of the PBS system? These actually tie directly back into the 2 trust assumptions that we described in the previous. So the first is we need hey, what's up, guys? The first is a commit reveal scheme to protect the builder from the proposer. So there needs to be a mechanism by which if a proposer commits to a builder's block, they can't equivocate, they can't take a different block and unbundle the transactions that were in the block that the builder made. And the second is an unconditional payment mechanism to protect the proposer. So in the same way that the relay checks that the builder's block accurately pays the proposer for the rights to produce that block, there needs to be a way that the proposer knows once they commit to a bid, they're going to get paid that bid no matter what the builder does, right? Like if I say I'm going to sell my slot for 1 ETH to a builder, I need to know that I'm getting that 1 ETH no matter what the builder does. So yeah, with that in mind, we can kind of run through what the simplest version of ePBS would look like, and then we'll get to the second half, which is just like the realities of what would happen if we actually did this enshrinement. And I put simplest in quotes because like it's not actually that simple, but the details here aren't too important beyond just like understanding the intuition of the 2 trust assumptions that we're trying to encode in the protocol. So the first is what we call this commit reveal thing, and we have this proposal which is called the Payload Timeliness Committee. It's pretty similar to what the current consensus mechanism looks like. The only difference is now you can have a consensus layer block, that's what CL stands for, without the execution payload. So basically you separate the part that the proposer produces from the part that the builder produces into 2 different pieces, and then you have attestations over each of those pieces. And the important thing here is that even if the proposer produces this block, the CL block, the execution payload might not show up if the builder decides not to reveal their payload for whatever reason. They might be offline, or they might decide it's no longer worth it to reveal their payload. But the proposer block, the CL block, still shows up on chain. The Payload Timeliness Committee is just what we call the committee that votes on if the builder's payload showed up on time. So the timeliness here matters because the payload could show up like after some amount of time, and then the builder could claim that they accurately performed their duty. But everyone needs to come to consensus like in a timely fashion to whether or not the state is updated with the payload or not. So there needs to be some notion of like this happened by a certain moment, because now we can all update the head of our chain based on the payload that did show up. And the payload is just a list of transactions. Like it's super simple, just raw transaction bytes. Cool. So this is the commit reveal. And the reason it's commit reveal is because Inside the consensus layer block, which is the thing that the proposer produces, is a commitment to a bid. And the bid is signed over, so there's like cryptographic evidence that the proposer is signing up for this bid. And if they sign up another block with a conflicting bid at the same height, then that's like a slashing penalty according to the protocol rules. So that's the enforcement mechanism. That's the guarantee that the builder gets when they see that there's a signed block with their header in it. Yeah, the second piece of this puzzle is the second trust assumption, which is we need a way for the proposer to have a guarantee that they're going to get paid if they commit to a bid. And this is this unconditional payment thing. The mechanism we have here is called top of block payments. And it's basically the simplest thing you could imagine, which is each bid comes with a payment transaction. The payment transaction is basically from the builder to the proposer, and it's conditioned on the proposer committing to a bid from that builder. So if a builder sends me a bid, they also send a transaction that says, if you sign my bid, I'll pay you 1 ETH for your block. And that's like kind of the process by which the proposer gets paid. And we call it top of block because the payment transaction comes first as the transaction in the block. And the reason this matters is because you need the payment to be valid, and you can only check the valid. Like as a proposer, I only know that the payment is valid at the top of the block rather than at the bottom of the block because I don't know the contents of the block itself. So this example kind of tries to map the flow of payment transactions and execution payloads in 3 different cases. So we have 3 blocks that are produced. The important difference between block n+1 and the others is that n+1 doesn't have a payload show up. So for whatever reason, the proposer signed this consensus layer block, but the execution payload never showed up. The builder never revealed their payload. But since the payment transaction was still included in the block, it still gets processed. The proposer gets paid. No harm, no foul, essentially. And then if you map these down into the actual like execution layer state, you see that the first payment transaction from block N comes first, then the execution payload, then the payment transaction for the second slot, and then the third payment transaction and the third payload. And so yeah, it's kind of just as simple as you could imagine. Like the first transaction in every block is the payment that pays the proposer from the builder. Cool. So that's what we would try to enshrine, right? So we now have, I guess, 2 things. We have this mechanism by which the builder and the proposer are producing 2 types of blocks, and there's a testing happening on each of those blocks. And then as part of the bid, there is this transaction that unconditionally pays the proposer. So now what would actually happen, right? This is kind of the crux of the argument and the main issue that we're facing right now when we're thinking about enshrining stuff. And it's this idea of bypassability. So in this figure, we have our proposer on the left, and there's kind of 3 different builders that we are trying to represent. The first is builder A, and they're a vertically integrated builder relay. So this is a very sophisticated builder that also has connections to the proposer. They're maybe geographically located, like co-located with a lot of proposers. And you can think of them as like the existing like big players of today. For builder B, they're not a builder relay, so they might still send some blocks to this independent relay, or they might send blocks to the P2P bid pool. And when we're talking about enshrining something, that's kind of what we're enshrining here, right? Like by getting rid of the relays, or by trying to get rid of the relays, we're saying all these bids will be communicated through the P2P layer, and it'll be fully trustless, on both sides, and everyone will just build blocks based on the bids they see in the mem pool, in the bid pool, which we call. And so builder C might just send blocks to the bid pool. And the issue here is the proposer of the slot will probably want to listen to all of these 3, right? They're profit maximizing. They're trying to sell their slot. They want to make the most money as possible. And so they're just going to say, oh, I'll listen to every source and decide which block to sign based on whichever one has the highest value at the moment where I'm ready to produce my block. And the issue here is that if you compare this kind of enshrined mechanism of the P2P layer with either the independent relay or the vertically integrated builder relay, there's some like pretty acute advantages that the relay has that are almost like impossible to get around. First is just the simple one, which is lower liquidity requirements. So as described in the previous slide, the unconditional payment mechanism is a top of block payment. So that means that the builder has to have the liquidity at the first transaction in the slot to make a bid. For most blocks, that's probably fine because they might be paying like 0.1 ETH or even like 1 ETH, which is kind of nothing for the builders. But during like crazy high MEV moments, they might need 200 ETH like of inventory that they can pay as the first transaction in the slot, even though they might be making that money through the slot rather than having it at the beginning of the slot. So that's kind of one issue. Another issue, and again, this one feels a bit like an impossibility result, is this reduced latency. So in this situation, there's just one hop, like one TCP connection to get from the vertically integrated builder relay to the proposer. That's like as fast as the speed of light, essentially. And especially if you think of these things as geographically distributed, potentially like co-located, like that's going to be on the order of like 10 milliseconds or less. Whereas both of these sources of bids have potentially like 2 and maybe even more hops involved. So if the builder needs to send to the relay and the relay needs to send to the proposer, that's 2 hops. If the builder's sending to the bid pool, there might be like a number of hops in the P2P layer before the bid actually hits the proposer. So there's just like, in general, we fully expect that the latency from the enshrined mechanism is going to be always worse than whatever like a centralized vertically integrated builder relay could provide. And the reason this latency matters is because like MEV is a constantly produced thing. As like the faster you can get bids from a builder to a proposer means like the later you can wait. And we're seeing this kind of play out right now with these whole like timing games things. So yeah, essentially the faster you get, the more money the proposer can make, the higher the bid, and thus the more likely the proposer is to use that bid for their block. And the third one is actually potentially the most important, and it's this idea of bid cancellations. So one thing that the relays can do is they offer a service to block builders and to people who want to do SexDex arbitrage, which is like arbitrage between a centralized exchange and a decentralized exchange. And that's this idea of cancellations. So if builders are making bids on the slot and the price on the centralized exchange moves against them, they want to be able to cancel that bid in order to avoid paying for something that like wasn't actually worthwhile in the end. And relays offer this service of cancellations where a builder can send a block that cancels a previous bid. So like maybe they said, oh, I'm willing to pay 10 ETH for this block, but then the price moves against them and suddenly they're only willing to pay 5 ETH. They can send a follow-up bid with a 5 ETH value and cancel their previous bid. In the mempool, in the bid pool, like there's just no way to do this, right? Once the message is propagated, there's kind of no clear way that a proposer who sees that message wouldn't be incentivized to just sign the highest one. Even if they saw a follow-up message that said from the builder, like, I want to cancel this, there's no way that the proposer doesn't have deniability. The proposer can just say, oh, I didn't see the cancellation message, and there's no enforcement mechanism on that cancellation. So yeah, that's the third and potentially most important issue with ePBS. So all of these things together just make it so that in all likelihood, the relays would continue existing much in today's form, even if we did enshrine something. And especially given the path dependence of MEV-boost exists, most validators are already hooked up to relays. Like getting them to disconnect from relays is probably a very difficult ask, especially for staking pools that are maybe competing on APR. And like this is basically asking them to leave money on the table. And like generally that's not a very good mechanism design property for these distributed systems. That kind of concludes the doom part of the talk. And at least one idea or one set of features that could result in something that looks a little bit better. And that's this idea of trustless relays. Trustless relays would be a lot different than the relays of today because, as implied by the name, there's no trust. And essentially what these relays would do is just accelerate the networking layer between the proposer and the builder. They'd kind of just act as a high-speed connection between the two without having to go through the P2P layer, like without slowing down by going through the many hops. And in reality, you could probably call these like something altogether different, like header forwarder or something like that. And this would be ideal because now, without trust, there's like a lot less incentive for builders to necessarily like co-locate and vertically integrate with the relays. And potentially it would be easier to run a relay if the risk associated with connecting to that relay was eliminated, right? Because no one has to trust the relay. The builder doesn't have to trust the relay. The proposer doesn't have to trust the relay. So the kind of commodification of relay services would be a lot easier. So what components would be necessary for a trustless relay? I think of it as kind of 3 things. First, you need an encrypted block. So this protects the builder, right? If the builder doesn't want to trust the relay, then they need to be able to send them an encrypted block without giving away and like leaking information about the transactions in there. The second thing is this second trust assumption that we described before, which is the proposer needs to know that the bid is valid and that the bid pays them accurately given how much was promised. And what you need here is you would need essentially like a full ZK EVM to say, hey, given this encrypted block, there's also a ZK proof that accompanies it that says this bid is valid and it pays the proposer accurately given what the bid represented. And that would almost be enough. So the third thing you need is the decryption method, because if, as the builder, I just encrypt the block and send a ZK proof that the bid is valid and that it pays the proposer enough, then I could still grief the proposer by just never decrypting the block, right? Like I'm the one who encrypted it. If I never decrypt it, then there's no way that the proposer can actually get the contents of their block and get paid for selling this slot. So the decryption method, there's like a few options here. You could do like a threshold thing where the builder encrypts it to the testing committee, and if like 50% of the testers vote for a block, then it gets decrypted. You could do like a delay function. That would be like potentially one of the best options. This is where Justin would say like, oh, use fully homomorphic encryption or whatever. And that's like, yeah, there's lots of like future math that like could maybe make this work, but these are kind of the three primitives that I think would make trustless relays work, and that's the goal, I guess. But yeah, there's kind of a lot of ifs here, so no guarantee that we're close to that point. This is my last slide, so thanks for listening. PBS is an infinite buffet. There's like many more designs and ideas being floated around, so definitely happy to chat if that interests you. Yeah, thanks.